listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Greetings and welcome. My name is Silas Rose, and this is episode 4 of Awake in Relationship. So I'm kind of making the assumption that, many people listening to this podcast are probably on some level very committed to a personal growth path. It could be a spiritual path that might involve maybe yoga or meditation, some sort of mindfulness practice. But you might also be aware that there is often a blind spot, particularly when it comes to relating to others. We might be able to sit in meditation for hours and rest peacefully, but when it comes to kind of relating to an intimate partner or children, the buttons get triggered and we're off. And this really speaks to the sense of separation or tension between our spiritual lives and our intimate lives. The beloved and recently departed spiritual teacher Ram Dass once said that if you think that you're enlightened, go spend a weekend with your family. So if you consider yourself a spiritual person, or perhaps you're just very committed to being more awake in the world, in your work and in your family, but you also struggle with the very human level of desire and the blind spots that come with that, I invite you to stay tuned with my conversation with Ethan Nichtern, Buddhist author and teacher living in Brooklyn, New York, as we discuss meditation and bringing our intimate relationships to the path. And today's episode, we're going to be chatting with Ethan Nichtern about meditation and bringing relationships to the path. And Ethan is a Buddhist author and teacher living in Brooklyn, New York. And his work has been featured in a number of national news outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, and Vogue magazine. He also has a podcast called The Road Home, which really explores contemporary Buddhist thought. And today we're going to be kind of dialing in on Ethan's most recent publication, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, which is kind of a deep dive into the path of relationships, particularly friendship, romance, and family. So, Ethan, good morning or good afternoon.
Thanks, Alice. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I must say that this book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, is probably one of the most kind of interesting amalgamations or kind of presentations of the Dharma, in the sense it's kind of an ode to this fairy tale, The Princess Bride. I'm kind of wondering, what kind of first connected you with this film, and what kind of compelled you to write a book about it?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ways into my intention behind the book, because it's really bringing together three things. One was a kind of love of pop culture in a contemporary or postmodern sense, and a particular personal love over the years for the movie and the book, but especially the movie, The Princess Bride. Mm-hmm. And also a desire to want to write something Buddhist about relationships without having to claim to be a relationship expert, because I don't think I am one. And also I think there's no such thing, mm-hmm. and which is something I explore in the book. And also a desire to want to share kind of a memoir piece, using my own experience. And also kind of this question of what it means to be a Buddhist practitioner who's, trying to figure out relationships, but also, the other thing about any ancient spirituality that we inherit is that there is always a kind of cultural narrative going, that's often hidden when you study ancient spiritual teachings, like that, for example, the life story of the Buddha is set against a certain kind of narrative structure of what a kind of, what somebody like Joseph Campbell might call the hero's journey or something like that. And there's a kind of pop culture narrative that kind of conditions our spiritual narrative. So in this era, like, I think a kind of very playful but very witty fairy tale, sort of does that. And my personal connection with The Princess Bride was that my father's best friend throughout his life, but growing up, was in the movie. So the book starts with saying, "Hello, my name is Ethan Nichtern. The six-fingered man was my father's best friend. Prepare to read." And that's Christopher Guest, who's, this is probably one of his least, if not his least funny role of all time, being the six-figured man. So that's why I saw the movie the first time. And it was 1987. So I was about 9 years old when it came out. And that also, was a moment situated in my life that, was a very powerful, and I won't say traumatic, although if we were kind of analyzing it from a psychological standpoint, there was a lot going on in my family and my spiritual world that year that was, really powerful and important. My parents getting divorced, both my parents' Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, passing away that year, and also my grandparents committing suicide that year, and especially my grandfather, because this is the story of a grandfather, reading this book to his grandson, played by a very ungrateful Fred Savage. And so there was a lot as kind of time went on, returning to the movie. I don't even know if I really liked it the first time I saw it, because I was 9 or so, and I don't think I got how kind of beautifully, the thing about The Princess Bride is it's beautifully sarcastic and ironic. It's making fun of the fairy tale genre the entire time, but it's also such a fairy tale. It's like it's very rare in the postmodern era to get something that undercuts a genre but totally celebrates the genre at the same time. And I think that's why The Princess Bride has been considered such a masterpiece. And I would return to it, especially in my teenage years. I mean, I think a lot of people have of my sort of late Generation X crowd or other, generations have a really strong connection with the movie and book, and just sort of love for it would grow. And there are a lot of little Dharma moments in it. And I got to, as I was writing the book, interview Mandy Patinkin, who plays Inigo Montoya, who is a practicing Zen Buddhist now. And so, I won't say that it's a Buddhist text or Buddhist movie, but there's a lot of really beautiful moments for somebody who's trying to live a playful but awakened life in relationships. So, I also wanted to give myself this writing challenge of sort of combining those three things of a kind of personal Buddhist take on relationships, friendship, romance, and family relationships make up the three sections of the book, my book, and also, really try to honor contemporary pop culture, because I do really think that it may feel a little kitsch or kind of superficial. I think some people probably thought writing a book called The Dharma of the Princess Bride is a fairly superficial take, but I really actually do believe genuinely that importing this classic Eastern spiritual and psychological tradition, it really has to be situated within our culture and understanding. And so, we do need more contemporary Buddhist narratives. And so even if it was a sort of a little bit of a messy thing to mix, love of this movie with some serious study and practice of Buddhism in relationship to relationships, I'm glad I tried.
Yeah, well, it's very personal, which I really appreciated. I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into your past, and in terms of, coming from a Chinese medicine perspective, I was an acupuncturist for 15 years. There's this kind of notion of an original wound that kind of sets a life trajectory. And so 1987 was kind of a big year for you. That's when the movie came out. And also when there was all this kind of upheaval for you at a very young age. And I'm just kind of wondering if that whole time kind of set you on the path. I know that you grew up in a Buddhist home. Your father is David Nichtern, a noted artist himself. And so I'm kind of wondering if this was sort of the genesis of your Buddhist journey. And when did you become kind of more serious about meditation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was, I mean, if I look back, like I remember going to Chogyam Trungpa's cremation in Vermont, which I think would have happened right before this movie came out. I believe that was his death was in April of 1987. I believe his cremation was late May, early June. And then, that was the last year that my parents, the last few years that they were together was very difficult. And that was the beginning of their divorce. And then my grandfather and my step grandmother, in a very sort of beautiful and problematic kind of Romeo and Juliet moment, because my grandfather had progressive Parkinson's disease, committed suicide together. Had like this lovely sort of final date night in their apartment, and were really dressed up, and then because he was a doctor and psychiatrist, I'm sure he had access to knowing how to do it relatively painlessly. So that all happened in like a 9-month or so or 1 year span. And then you're going to fourth grade trying to figure out how to be a kid. So I remember, Silas, that actually I really liked, like I would sometimes sit with my parents for like a minute. I remember around this time, sometime around this time, I think it may have been just before this, I did a children's class at the Shambhala Center taught by Eric Spiegel, who was very brave to teach a group of kids. And we met for like 6 weeks. And so I would try to meditate a little, but my memory is that when my parents got divorced, I really didn't want anything for a few years to do with their Buddhist practice, because I think I was angry at them, and there was a sense of like, why can't you two be peaceful together if you're meditators and studying Buddhism, etc. And obviously, we know as meditators that it doesn't make everything calm or smooth, but they're obviously, a young child can resent his parents for something like that, or can transpose anger onto that, or sadness or grief onto that. So it came on. I remember my freshman year of high school, I read a few Buddhist books and really liked, kind of in my head, arguing with them. And I really liked sort of how much philosophical kind of grist for the mill reading somebody like Chogyam Trungpa or Thich Nhat Hanh or Suzuki Roshi gave me. And then it was, I would say, sophomore year of college, I did the first weekend of the Shambhala training program. So did sophomore year of high school, when I was about 15, did the first weekend of meditation. And then it kind of grew from there. I would say I had a regular meditation practice by like the end of high school. And I sometimes joke with people, it was after my first girlfriend in college, which was my first girlfriend ever, really, broke up with me after a very intense freshman year. That's when I really knew I was a Buddhist. So, So yeah, it kind of developed like that. But I would actually say that at the time that this book is situated, I kind of rejected my parents for for their Buddhist practice because I kind of questioned it in relationship to their separation and divorce.
So let's kind of, dive right into the guts of the book, really, which is one of the things that you talk about early on in the Dharma of the Princess Bride is that, the most important relationship you can have is the one with yourself. And, that's quite a profound statement. And I just wondering if you can kind of unpack that a bit. And how does kind of meditation help that process of forming a relationship with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I think the way I would say that now, which is not quite the way I said it in the book, is, in every relationship with any other person, whether it's a relationship with, a friend, a student, a lover, a lifelong partner, a parent, or a child, your mind is so present there that, all of our relationships with other people are in some ways relationships with ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and to say that conversely, actually, when you look at what actually creates our sense of self, it's so conditioned by our relationships, especially our close and intimate relationships,
Mm-hmm.
that you're kind of always relating to yourself, and when you're in relationship with others, you're relating to yourself, and when you're in relationship to yourself, you're relating with what you've inherited from others, so no matter what, your own mind is key and is central to that. And so, I think a lot of times people think of meditation as sort of kind of caging the wild animal, or like the bad me, like if I could just get bad me to sit still and not cause too much harm, then that's kind of calm abiding, and obviously that's going to turn a meditation practice into feeling like sort of like a prison warden, like,
Mm-hmm.
or like a principal or like a sheriff. And, the thing that I really like coming from the Tibetan system, but I would say this is true of any Buddhist system. But Chogyam Trungpa definitely coined this phrasing of meditation being a process of actually making friends with yourself,
Mm-hmm.
because the thing about relationships is we are constantly bouncing our mind off of other people and sort of wondering what they think of us, and we have very little time in life to actually say, like, who is this person? What is it like to have a mind?
Think of social media and the growth development that kind
Yeah,
of mass projection happens.
of course. Yeah, of course. So that notion and that beautiful notion of meditation not being about, some philosophical exercise where you try to obliterate or forget the self, although that's certainly part of some understanding of Buddhist philosophy and psychology, and it not being about, containing or going into this calm, concentrative state where you transcend yourself, but actually just getting to know, who am I? And if there is a wound there, which there is,
Mm-hmm.
and there's also, brilliant eccentricity, that you really, you get to know that. And, and I think that's the key to relationships. I mean, I remember studying, in classic Buddhism, there's major and minor marks of a fully awakened being. And I remember in my first book writing this, that one of the marks of a completely enlightened person is that they don't act any differently, whether they're alone or amongst others, that there's just a sense of integration and authenticity, and having some relationship to ourselves, and kind of becoming more transparent to ourselves is, I think, a huge part of how we actually relate to others. And then the other part of that is, how do our relationships actually help us know ourselves in a loving and caring and basically good way more. So it goes in both directions. It's not one and it's not the other, but your mind is the thing that's always there, and even when we think we're having a sense of another person, it's actually transposed through the conduit of our own mind. So we're going to have to make friends with that conduit no matter what, and
yeah, that's a sort of the path quality, and I think that's, one of the things I really kind of struggle with right now is, I think it's really awesome that mindfulness is kind of, entered this kind of golden era. It's kind of become the new yoga on some level, but it seems kind of often so divorced from this kind of bigger view.
I mean, I think that's true. No, I had on my podcast, which is The Road Home, which was also the title of the overview book of Buddhism that I wrote before Dharma, the Princess Bride. So my last conversation was with author and writer Jay Michelson, and he currently, one of the things he does, he's written some sort of modern takes on Buddhism, including a book called Evolving Dharma. But one of the things he does is develops a lot of the content for the 10% Happier app, which is the newscaster Dan Harris, who's become a huge practitioner and advocate of mindfulness. So it's this app, which is just like a podcast, is a very could be a very quick take on developing a practice, while sitting in your own home, and it could be very superficial. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, this app reaches thousands of hundreds of thousands people, I believe. And Jay was saying, and he's a very serious practitioner, like he sort of hopes that the Dharma becomes even more superficially accessible. That we needed to go to more places, even if the effect of that is only a very kind of superficial glean on what mindfulness is. I agree with you, Silas, that it is sad when somebody talks about just mindfulness as like follow your breath or something like that, and doesn't have the view, which is very vast, which includes a lot of different topics, ethics. It includes a notion of kind of social ethics, and I think in this day and age has to include a kind of view of not causing harm and bringing benefit in a much more social and cultural and political context. It has a view of a huge body of teachings of how working with the mind evolves. But I also think, that there was supposedly a prophecy by the Buddha that the Dharma would never be ruined by somebody misusing it. It would only be ruined if the people who teach it lose the view, Mm-hmm. And so I think even if you give somebody a little touch into like, sure, download this 5-minute meditation, if that brings them into a deepening relationship, then even if that takes a while, even if those seeds take, lifetimes to kind of start to sprout, then it's still a move in a positive direction. So,
Trump and Boucher talked about infiltrating society. I have this kind of wacky idea that, we have yoga, it's become so popular and there's so many accessories like yoga pants. We need meditation pants. That's like the next level above the app.
Right, meditation pants. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how has Lululemon or any of these other companies, have they developed meditation pants yet?
I'm going to be trademarking this.
Yeah, I also imagine somebody walking down a street in one of the cities in what I like to call the Kale Belt, which a phrase a friend and I coined that I talked about in this book. A city like a Brooklyn, or like a Toronto, or like a Portland, Oregon, or something like that. The way people walk down the street with their yoga mats strapped to their back. Like, would there ever be a time when people walk down the street with zafus or gomdens strapped to their back? Meditation benches. I don't know.
It's coming. So, aloneness is a big part of this process, making a relationship with yourself. And what do you see as the kind of the downside of kind of skipping over this process of making friends with yourself when it comes to, say, dating?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, my take is I think there might be a realization that we've only focused on one of these, you know. So for example, to realize that you've been dating or pursuing romantic relationships and have done very little making friends with yourself means that you have to balance that out. You know, the same way I would say, like I often joke from a modern psychological perspective that the historical Buddha, you know, from an attachment theory standpoint, would probably be considered avoidant, you know, attachment. And so perhaps if you notice that you're spending too much time with yourself, you would say, I need to balance that out by actually practicing in relationships. But, you know, I do think to the direction I think you were going with that, we can cause a lot of harm to self and others by not, you know, knowing our intentions, you know, in terms of dating. And I feel like, you know, as I talk about in the book, like that was sometimes like sort of, you know, going into sort of like, for example, who I was, and walking around with a kind of checklist of sort of looking for buttercup, you know, which is this beautiful kind of joke of an ideal that of an ideal person, played by Robin Wright in The Princess Bride. You know, that goes into this sort of like getting into like what is it that we're actually looking for and why, and what is it that we are missing in ourselves, you know. I mean, I think that's the other side of this, is that a lot of times in Eastern spiritual traditions, including even, you know, the tradition that you and I have studied the most, like Tantric Buddhism, even in a tradition like that seems to be so embracive of desire, there's still a lot of degrading of desire, you know. So I think that is part of this conversation too, is like, there's something beautiful about desire, something beautiful about wanting to connect with another person and wanting to, there's a realization in our aloneness of like, that we don't see everything, that we don't know everything, you know. And so there's a desire to say like, I really want to connect with somebody who has a different experience from me, you know. And perhaps some of it is animalistic, you know, but it's also this sort of like, I don't just want to have my intimate perspective on the world. That being said, if we're not clear about why we want to connect with another person or other people, and it's not, you know, there's many different types of relationships. And sometimes when people say, well, this type of relationship wouldn't be Buddhist or would be Buddhist, or, you know, are you supposed to be monogamous? Are you supposed to be this? Are you supposed to be that? There's apparently a commentary that is attributed to the Dalai Lama, where he came across as dismissive of gay or non-heteronormative queer relationships. You know, I don't think any of that is part of Buddhist thought. I think what Buddhist thought is saying is, if we're not clear about what we're actually looking for, we are either going to end up trying to use another person or turn another person. And I think this was a little bit more, you know, my buttercup approach, into a kind of savior, you know, which I think is another thing that we do in our spiritual lives, you know, looking for the right community or the right teachings, or especially the right teacher, and sort of putting them in this position of like, they are going to, I won't have to get to know myself because they're going to fix everything for me, you know. And so this kind of, we either end up trying to manipulate other people or idealizing them, which is actually a form of manipulation, you know. When you're idealizing a person, you're not actually seeing them. But so I think being really clear about why we're trying to connect with a person, and doing it with a sense of equality and interdependence, and clarity of knowing our own mind, you know. But we can't know our own mind. My argument is not you should become fully enlightened before you go out on a date. It's that we because I don't think there'd be a lot of people on Tinder or any of the new sites, which I got married before all the new right before all the new dating apps came out. So
lucky you.
I'm a little bit behind which is which.
I actually kind of want to go into that a bit because, you describe in detail, your experiences with your buttercup, which, didn't particularly end well. And you went through a period of being single and dating. And I think that was around 5 years, where you kind of explored a lot of stuff. And I'm just kind of wondering what was the process that you went through personally to kind of let go of that buttercup myth and make yourself kind of open and receptive to meeting your current life partner.
Yeah. I mean, and it's all obviously you construct you can construct too much of a fairy tale narrative about the progression, right? Hero or heroine goes through challenge, survives, learns lesson, and then has the appropriate outcome. And even in my more confused dating time of not knowing exactly what I wanted, or other people being confused about me, there was a lot of wisdom, a lot of true connection. And even in my time with my wife, sometimes we don't there's still a lot of work to be done in that relationship too. So you don't want to idealize the progress, but there is some sense of progress. And I think it's important for spiritual practitioners and Buddhists to actually acknowledge progress, so that it's not so we're not moving too much into the don't have any goal or don't have any desire to move forward in mind. But it's not a one-to-one process. And for me, I think it's actually sort of, a lot of times it's when you lose things, or when they don't work out, or when you get dissed, or when you miscommunicate with somebody, or you don't, you look back and say, God, I wish I had been more authentic, or communicated more clearly my desires there, or known my mind there. A lot of times you only know your mind or your heart kind of after the fact, so there has to be room for seeing the buttercup myth, or what I call the having a checklist. Like, you don't always have a conscious checklist. A lot of times it's when it doesn't work out, you say, oh, I was really holding on to that. I was really fixated on this piece of it. And with the buttercup experience that led, into this sense of like kind of being lost at sea, the way I described it, there was a real sense of like, oh, like I really, really, really idealized this person and this relationship. And for a while, just tried to, pretend that our total inability to communicate with each other was going to be workable, And then so you go into it, and, part of the time you're saying like, maybe I'm not cut out for, deep partnership relationships. And part of the time you're saying, let's really look for somebody who I can communicate with, let's change the checklist of what I'm looking for. And some of that's just a maturation process. And I think a Dharma practice or a meditation practice can definitely help you work with your mind during that life practice. It can be kind of a support for that. I think in a sense you have to give up your savior complex enough times, and then you just show up. And that was definitely my experience of meeting my wife. It was this very interesting experience of enough times of just saying like, just give up, because you get kind of like beat up, a little bit by the whole thing. And I equated that to Wesley's process in becoming the Dread Pirate Roberts, where he goes through this process where he literally has a guru, and who he thinks is going to kill him every day, and he's just like, so he just gives up on his own survival. But meanwhile, he's basically learning how to be this like ridiculous swashbuckling pirate. And it's through the process of like thinking he's never going to see his true love again, and he's not even going to survive to the next day, that he develops all of these skills. And then, in that case, the fairy tale piece is that he's delivered back to his original love, which I don't think happens very often for many of us. It's more like then you're delivered to the present and maybe something opens up, but it depends on the causes and conditions in the external world, which is incredibly complicated. So that's the other Buddhist lesson, I think, is sometimes you learn your spiritual or psychological lesson, and then it doesn't just mean everything falls into place for you, because there still has to be what other people are doing, and the outer conditions have to align, so it's not just like some spiritual lesson of like you learn to let go and then the kingdom of Dharma is showered upon you. It's more like then you just show up and it's pretty mundane, but then you're looking for connections and open to possibilities that your habitual mind wasn't open to. And the interesting thing is, meeting my wife, I actually met a person that would have fit most of the better qualities on my earlier checklist, on my 20 something, like early 20s, like less mature checklist. And, but there was a real kind of desire to communicate and a real desire to connect. And I think we were just kind of ready for each other. And the cause and conditions of meeting, we happened to meet, and, we both wanted a long-term relationship, that's the other piece of it is, any working relationship, whether it's friendship, whether it's, romantic relationship, I would say, family is a little bit different, but you have to both really want to work with stuff, and so sometimes when friends or Dharma students, ask me for relationship advice, it's like, I always have a feeling that things are going to work if there's a sense that both people want to work on it, and if both people don't want to work on it, it's not going to happen. So, I managed to find a relationship with somebody I really, really connect with. And when there's rough spots, we both want to work on it. And, they do say relationship is a mirror. And I think that's the other part. That's the wisdom aspect of our kind of neurotic tendency to always, when we don't have a real deep, contemplative practice and ability to make friends with ourselves, we look for our sense of self in terms of what we think other people think of us. But the wisdom side of that is when you're in any kind of trusting relationship, which could be a dear friend, could be a partner, could be therapist, could be a teacher, could be a mentor, could be a guru. I do still believe that that's possible. When you're in a trusting relationship, then the relationship becomes feedback, and you actually say like, oh, I'm seeing in you that you're actually reflecting back to me with clear feedback this thing that I need to work on or need to open to. And it becomes very powerful, and that's why I do think, there's an old Zen proverb about, if you want to know if a Zen master is enlightened, I'm going to degender it because it's coming from a very patriarchal setup. But if you want to know if a Zen master is truly enlightened, ask their spouse, what dear departed Baba Ram Dass said, one of my favorite quotes by him, was, anybody who thinks they're enlightened should go spend a week with their family, because there's a real mirroring quality in those intimate relationships, and I think that's, to me, that is, and maybe it's just I'm a relational person in our tantric system of the 5 wisdoms. I would definitely consider myself a pretty Padma person. So maybe this is just my way of looking at the teachings. Maybe my eventual path to awakening, if I'm on such a thing, would be more the anxious attachment style rather than the avoidant one. But I do think we need more stories of awakening that aren't about leaving the world behind, that are relational, that are social, which doesn't mean the person wouldn't do their solitary retreats or practice, but there'd be more teachings about how they awakened in relationship, and that's part of why I want to write this book, to find a playful way of exploring that.
Yeah. So on this notion of, spending a weekend with your parents to find out if you're enlightened. So you're a new parent, and I think your daughter is 2 years old now.
Yeah, closing in on 3. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Three-nager, as they say.
Yeah. So how's that going?
Oh, it's ridiculously awesome. It's really awesome. And, she can be a handful. And, there's definitely, there's a sense of lineage and the beauty of that. And sort of, because you kind of hear yourself kind of like, what do I want to teach or offer this person? And I'm really trying to hold the view that my main job is to be a good presence when I can, and to try as best I can not to teach her anything that is my preference or just my projective way of being in the world, but to really, my job is to keep her safe. And if she asks for wisdom or learning about something, and it's something that I know that I want to share, here's how I would do that thing, or here's how to not cause harm to another person. But I'm really trying not to tell her how to be, in the world. But it is a real mirror, because you hear yourself saying things, and you're like, am I just saying what my dad said to me or what my mom said to me in the way that I did, that I considered to be wisdom, or the way that I considered to be confused or neurotic? And but it's a really amazing practice. And I think that's another one. Like, if you want to know if somebody is awake, like, see how they change a diaper, which is actually, I had spent quite a lot of time with little kids, but that's a thing, especially when you're a man in this world. Like, you don't get many opportunities to change diapers until you have your own child. And that's the other interesting thing of being a parent, is you one, I think for me, as a heterosexual person who believes we live in a very patriarchal and misogynistic society, like with my wife, like, just seeing like how difficult it is and empowered it is to be a working woman. It gave me it gave me a lot of respect for that. Like, just to watch her work every bit as hard at her work as I was, meanwhile turning her body into a person creating factory, and being able to handle all of that, just like gave me tremendous respect for mothers and working mothers, specifically. And so trying to figure out who we are in relationship to each other is a huge practice. But, there's so much theorizing about what parenthood is going to be, especially in those, slightly more privileged, middle class kale belt locations, like where you're encouraged to read 700 blog posts about like the most compassionate, mindful way to buy and change diapers, et cetera. And then you're just there, and it's like, okay, it's me and you, baby, and we'll see what works. It's a practice, and that's the beautiful thing about relationships too, is there's a lot of theorizing, but there's not really a recipe. You just kind of show up and see what works, and so it's been a really beautiful, contained but somewhat formless practice in that way.
You're still finding time to practice meditation?
Yeah. I mean, because there's more freedom with figuring out which Dharma practices I want to do right now. A lot of times I'll wake up very early to do my practice, so that's definitely a thing, is getting used to, it's gotten a little bit better, but getting used to less sleep, and still how to like not turn that into like some cross to bear, like still trying to practice self-care. But I'll often wake up in the very early hours, like 5:30 or 6, and do, half hour, an hour practice then. And it's definitely different. It's I think that's the other thing, is the Western Buddhist traditions, especially those that, come from the Tantric, Himalayan, Tibetan genre, have to do a lot more work figuring out what practice structures are actually going to work for parents and working parents and people with families in the Western world, because there's definitely a shift, I don't think if I was still doing, for example, like what I did in my early mid-20s, the Nundro, the in-depth preliminary practices, which you do like, 2.5, 3-hour sessions. I don't think I could do that as a parent. So yeah, definitely figuring out how to balance personal practice with relational practice is huge. But I think that's also why we have to give more credit to the idea of relational practice counting in Buddhist circles specifically.
Absolutely. So that's probably a great place to end. I know you have to kind of move on to another appointment. Ethan, how can people connect with you and your work?
Sure. EthanNichtern.com is my website. You can, get on my mailing list, which we send out an email update once or twice a month. I'm on all the social media things that a person my age is on. So I'm not on like the TikTok or anything like that, but I'm on Instagram, or Twitter is where I try to follow and make sense of the American and global political madness. So you can follow me there, or just send me an email via my website if anybody wants to connect. But thanks so much for having me, Silas. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Ethan for this great conversation. And again, if you want to connect with Ethan, you can go to ethannichtern.com. And his books are up on Amazon, so check that out. If you have any questions or feedback, I really welcome that. And please head on over to awakenrelationship.com. Send me a message. And also, if you like this episode, hit subscribe, and I would really appreciate a review. So, till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.